Yeah, let's wait for 1 more minute in order to not let more participants joining in. During this period, you are welcome to say hello to us and tell us about your location. We are happy to have these opportunities to interact with you all. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to the IFLA ENSULIB webinar series presenting by ENSULIB, IFLA's Environment, Sustainability, and Library sections. Today's webinar is about urban roles of public buildings and spaces. My name is Priscilla Poon. I work for the University of Macau Library. I'm currently the secretary of ENSULIB. Today, I will be facilitating this webinar with Anna, who is also the standing committee member of ENSULIB. Before we begin, let me start with some notes on privacy and administration. This webinar is being recorded. The video will be posted on YouTube and the link will be posted on ENSULIB's webpage, as well as on other social media. Microphones have been muted for this event. If you have any questions or comments, please type in the chat or Q&A box. If you have questions regarding privacy, please send an email to professionalsupport@ifla.org. And now I'm pleased to invite Anna to introduce about the speakers today. Anna, please.
Thank you, Priscilla. Hi, all. I'm pleased to welcome Matej Nikšić, PhD, who will be the speaker of this webinar today. Matej is a senior research associate at the Urban Planning Institute of the Republic of Slovenia, URRS Ljubljana, where he specializes in urban planning and design. As an architect with degrees from the University of Ljubljana and Oxford Brookes University, he has a keen focus on enhancing urban public spaces and livability, promoting sustainability, driving urban regeneration, and advocating for participatory planning. Today's webinar title is Urban Roles of Public Buildings and Spaces, the Public Library as a Community Space. The changed role of libraries requires a reconsideration of their spatial design and image, both in terms of architecture, form, and urban placement. Let us now invite Matej to have a word. Matej, please. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Priscilla and Anna. Hello, everyone. It's very nice to be in this international gathering today. Thank you for inviting me to give this lecture. It's a pleasure to be with the profession that we usually do not cooperate, to be very honest, unfortunately. I come from the architectural background. but I'm a practicing urban planner. I work as a researcher in Ljubljana, in Slovenia, at the Urban Planning Institute, as Anna already mentioned, which is actually an interdisciplinary national institution that is trying to understand our cities in order to make them better. So we are doing research, and then this research is being translated into the policies at the end. And of course, it influences how the cities operate and how do they look. I mainly work with my team in the field of urban regeneration and the issues of urban public spaces. And that's actually where also the questions of the public facilities and public buildings come into the story. And we put this special focus on participatory approaches. So we don't want to work in our own urban planning silo, and we are trying to develop some more participatory and more inclusive practices. Why I was so happy to get this invitation to talk about public buildings, because public buildings are really an essence of any city, of any true city. If there is no public buildings and no public facilities in the settlements, we hardly talk about the city. Next, please, Priscilla. In this short lecture, we will focus on three main topics. One will be a very short and very general overview of the historical development of the public facilities in the cities. Then we will try to understand the contemporary roles of the public buildings in general, but then libraries in particular. And then I will put some attention to contemporary urban design and architectural design in relation to libraries, and how do we as urban planners see the libraries and their roles in the nowadays cities. Next. Let me start with a bit of a theory which is related to urban planning, more precisely to the paradigm of new urbanism. New urbanism is a paradigm that developed as a critique of the modernistic planning. I'm pretty much sure that all of us are facing the consequences of the modernistic planning. These are the parts of the cities that were built after the Second World War, so in 50s, 60s, and 70s, and were following the so-called functionalism theory and practice. And functionalism was always actually segregating the usages around the city and proposing monofunctional zones in different parts of the cities. So we would have, for example, large housing areas in the cities, large industrial areas, or large administrative areas, which were all separated from one to another. And new urbanism, which I already mentioned, actually was a critique to this functionalistic urban planning. And it actually linked it back to the historical tissues and historical approaches to making the city. On the screen, we see a sketch or ideogram made by Luxembourgian colleague Léon Crière, which was meant to actually critique the functionalistic city and saying that the city needs to mingle and actually combine and mix two essential components. One he called res publica, which we can see on the first sketch, and the other is called res economica, which is in the second sketch. Res publica is the part of the city that belongs to everybody. So these are public buildings, public institutions, or any places where public life takes place. Of course, these buildings and these kind of places are outstanding. They need to be special in their design. They need to be prominent in order to illustrate and actually echo the importance of living together. On the other hand, we also need in the city a very common and very kind of very everyday tissue where the everyday life takes place. These are the private areas, which should be by Crière much decent in their design, much less ambitious, but they're equally important to compose the city. And then when we put these two layers together, so one upon another, we really get the city. So by CREARE, the city is always composed of this private, everyday looking tissue, and then outstanding structures and buildings that really symbolize but also make the society function. If I compare this, for example, to anatomy, to the medical profession, CREARE was saying that res publica can be seen as the bones of the body, like res economica is the meat of the body. So you have the bones which hold the city, but then the meat that makes it really function. And I think this nice sketch by CREARE is the essence of how we shall perceive the placement of the public buildings and public programs into the today's city. As you can see in his sketch, these public buildings are scattered around. They are not composed in one small unit, which would be densifying all of them in a small area, but actually scattering them around the city. Because CREARE was also saying that public buildings are actually the ones that build our identity. So every neighborhood, every district of the city should have public buildings, public facilities in order to develop this local identity, but not only identity, also the local pride. Next, Priscilla. If we go a bit back to the future, we can see that public buildings were a very important part of the ancient cities or ancient civilization in general. We can go back all the way to Mesopotamia, Egypt, or Greece and Rome. And we can see that public buildings were mainly linked to the religious and governmental functions at the time. This means that the typologies at that time were mainly temples, some palaces, but also some assembly halls where public life was taking place. If we go to the Greek example, which is shown on this image, these public buildings were mainly linked to the main agora of the city, which was the main public space. And then these public buildings would usually form the background of the main public square in the Greek city. Next. Then in medieval time, of course, feudalism rose and different social and economic relations appeared, which was also reflected in the buildings. All of the sudden, cathedrals, castles, monasteries, and also town halls became very important buildings in any urban settlements. And as we can see here, these are very prominent buildings. Whenever you go to the medieval city or the city that has very well preserved medieval tissue, you would see that these civic buildings were kind of outstanding. It was very visible where the public life was taking place. Next one. Then after the medieval times, Renaissance and Baroque took place. Of course, this was the times where the interest in humanism and art was rising. And this brought new types of public buildings into the cities. For example, theaters, universities, courthouses, palaces, this kind of typologies that we can see in the Renaissance cities still nowadays appear in the cities. These buildings are usually quite large in their extent, and this also reflects this belief into the humanism and the human-centric approach of the Renaissance philosophy. Next one. Then a very distinctive period in developing the public spaces and public buildings was the Industrial Revolution, of course. This was indeed a revolution in the architectural field as well, because the new technologies allowed the new architectural typologies to appear. We would have really large buildings like train stations or even civic buildings for living that would appear in the industrial revolutions. And this was the era in the history that really meant a change of the scale of the public buildings. Not all of the buildings would be of large scale, but many of the public buildings became really large scale buildings. Besides public buildings, in this area, we also get lots of new other typologies like production units, crafts units, industrial enterprises that really change the scale of the city as such. And that really called into the action, the urban planning profession, in order to rethink and to redesign the cities as a whole. Next one. In this very short historic overview, we are now at the last stage, that's the contemporary or modern period. This is the period which we are actually living nowadays, and it's really influenced by a very fast technological development. And not just technological development, also globalization forces and influences. And of course, this has a very direct influence onto the public buildings, which are changing their functions. The new typologies are appearing. This image is actually showing one of the libraries in Finland. And all these new public facilities are actually trying to catch up with the development of the society, technology, economy that has a very fast race nowadays. This short overview of the historical phases was aiming to show how actually evolving the field of public buildings is, and how eager actually urban planners understand the role, but also the conditions within which the public buildings in the cities appear in order to provide good facilities for contemporary living. Next one. If you try to be a bit theoretical or conceptual, we can say that public buildings nowadays would actually fall under one of these three categories. They are usually educational institutions, which are schools, kindergartens, universities, libraries, and alike buildings, which really have a very strong impact into everyday urban life. Then there is a second large group, which is cultural buildings, which are museums, theaters, art galleries, and alike buildings, which are really important to promote culture, but also identity of places. And then the last group, which covers all the other typologies. This is like administration buildings, courthouses, city halls, and buildings that are related to government, and are really important for the approval and strengthening of the democratic processes. And these are the three categories that usually urban planning is dealing with and trying to find the right places, so the right locations, but also the right typologies in order to support urban living at the city level, but also at the local district levels. Next one. Of course, urban development nowadays is not only extending the cities anymore. This is the paradigm of the last century, so of the 20th century. In some parts of the world, the cities are still physically growing very fast, so we can still talk about the classical urban development. When new infrastructure is built, the new territories are being urbanized. But in the developed world, the urban development is taking another shape nowadays. We talk about urban regeneration, which is actually more focusing on the rethinking and refurbishing, reestablishing the parts that were urbanized in the past centuries, and are underused or not used at all anymore. So the issue of contemporary urban planning is not that much about how do we develop new structure or the new infrastructure, but how do we think the already existing urban tissue and bring it to the better living conditions. So bring it to the higher quality for the citizens at the end. And that's very important to understand that urban development nowadays doesn't mean extending the city or building something new, but it means more often how do we do better and more with what already exists. And that's very important to understand within the course of the public facilities and public buildings, because the investment into the new infrastructure is usually quite high, while regenerating what's already existing and what's already supported by the existing infrastructure can save some public funds and bring higher quality and more programs into the schemes. Next one. Urban planning, of course, is also very much linked to the sustainable development, which I'm pretty much sure everybody of us knows very well. Sustainable development has three main pillars: the social sustainability, environmental sustainability, and economic sustainability. And when we talk about public facilities, all three pillars are very important. Social sustainability links directly to the livable, socially just living environments that will really strengthen the community. And this is very easily, not easily in practice, but in theory, easily achieved through development of the public facilities and public programs. Environmental sustainability is actually also very important, because public facilities and public buildings are the ones that give us example to everybody, to every citizen, to every public entity, to anyone who is actually co-designing the city. And if public buildings would not be environmentally sustainable, we would be passing the wrong message to the society as such. And last but not least, economic sustainability. I already mentioned that when we establish public programs and public facilities in the city, we have to be economically viable. And this directly links us more to the urban regeneration. So urban rethinking of the already existing structures in order not to be only environmentally sustainable, but also economically sustainable. That's a very important issue that we sometimes tend to forget. Next one. When we talk about urban planning, how do we then deal with placing public infrastructure into the structure of the city? We always have to have at least two layers of the urban structure in mind. One is the morphological structure, so the physical layout of the city, which talks mainly about what are the built-up areas and what are the open areas in the cities, and where the main links between these areas go, as well as how dense the city is. This is an example of my city, Ljubljana. It's a typical radiocentric city. And this image is showing how the city densities are planned to be in the future. So along the main roads, you would have higher densities, which are marked in black here. And then the densities go lower towards the hinterlands of this main development axis. Why is this important? Because where the higher density is provided, there is more appropriate location to place the public buildings. Next one. The other one is the functional structure of the city. This is where we try to understand how the city is operating and where the most intensively used programs of the city shall be placed. As you can see again on the case study of Ljubljana, all the mixed uses are placed where the high density would appear in the morphological structure, again, along the main access roads. However, you can also see some violet dots all around the city, and this relates to the local accessibility of most prominent and most needed public functions of the city. And here you can again see how important it is to distribute the public functions, the public facilities all around the city. Even if the city on daily needs can run just by running along the main access roads, here on the example of Ljubljana, it's important to scatter the public facilities all around the city. So even if this is a quite simple sketch, it's very important from the conceptual point of view. And if we really follow this kind of development that would scatter and take care of all the city in terms of the public facilities, then we believe the city would be also just and everybody would have access to the basic quality of urban living. And then if you go to the next image, last but not least, urban planners are also interested in so-called thematic and unthematic tissues. Thematic tissues in the city are those who actually relate to the everyday life, so housing areas, industrial production areas, and so on, and are the basis for the functioning of the city. While unthematic tissues are the ones that stand out, so they are one of their kind, they are distinctive for the city. This is the case of Ljubljana again, and you can see that these unthematic tissues that are marked with these different colors are again scattered all around the city. And they directly also link to the public buildings because we believe that public facilities, public programs should be present all around the city. Next one. Public buildings are indeed fostering community engagement and social cohesion. If we place them correctly and if we program them correctly, they will really bring us together, us as a society, as communities, and they will really kind of force us to be interactive with each other. So if we fail to provide this kind of places, the society will not be as cohesive as it should be at the end. Here I'm showing by purpose a public building, which is actually a public library, because public libraries nowadays, as we will see later, really hold many functions, not only the library programs, but really should serve as true community centers. Next one. This is a quite famous quote of Scott Hansen from 2012, which was actually trying to say that we shouldn't be afraid of the changed function of the public library as a public institution. If libraries used to be the knowledge temples in the history, they are being reconceptualized nowadays, not only by the activities that they hold, but also the facilities that are located in these buildings. And last but not least, also the design. So the public libraries should not be kind of introverted places where knowledge is being contemplated and grasped, but should be also changing the design and opening their doors, opening their physical architectural design to the outer spaces, to be inviting places for the local community. Not everybody is maybe interested in reading the books, but everybody should have interest to enter nowadays the library in order to join the social and community life. This is the main idea that Scott Hansen has posed, and I think it's quite important to have this in mind when we reconsider the role of public buildings and public libraries in particular nowadays. Next one. So what's actually the role of the public libraries nowadays? As I said, it's really evolving, and it's transitioning from the libraries actually into the modern community hubs that would have multifunctional spaces. Besides the library facilities, the typical library facilities, libraries are also becoming maker spaces. They're offering co-working areas. They are more and more important as the event venues of smaller or bigger scales. And they are actually also engaging the locals, not only the private entities, but also institutions, associations into collaborative endeavors. And if we have this in mind, we can see that public library is library only by its name nowadays. That's how we would define it as urban planners. But in essence, it should be actually a mixed-use place where, of course, books and knowledge is still the main leading theme, but many other functions and programs are running at the same time. Next one. Here we tried to map few of the functions that we see as very important as urban planners for the public libraries nowadays. Unfortunately, some colors are not very well seen, but I hope you can read it. I'll try to shortly explain it, and then we will see some examples how this paradigm is actually embedded into some real projects around the world. So libraries, as we understand them today, should be the social hubs. As I already said, that's where the community life should happen at its best, where the community should have proud to be and to present its activities, its beliefs, its values. It's also the place where creation should take place. So they should become creative hub where new ideas, where innovation is actually at home, and where people come together in order to exchange knowledge and ideas among themselves directly and develop some new ideas. Then contemporary public building is also the prime place where the sustainability should be presented. We talk a lot about sustainability for more than 2 decades, but in practice, sometimes we are still not very good in implementing it. And public library as a truly community hub is the place where sustainability should be taken seriously and really presented to the users of the library in practical terms. This means that the whole building as such should be designed in accordance with all the sustainability parameters, but also the functioning, so the everyday running of the public library should be sustainable. In Slovenia, I have seen many good examples how libraries are actually pioneering in this field. They're really trying to develop new approaches to the everyday functioning to show people how sustainability should be actually lived every day. Then the public library is also the place where I believe, and we believe as urban planners, urban heritage should be celebrated and promoted. This links actually to the decision where the public library should happen nowadays. I strongly believe that we do need new libraries, new buildings, which will pioneer also the advancement of architecture, the new architecture. On the other hand, public libraries should be also placed in the already existing architecture and urban tissue. This means that some industrial halls, some not used transportation hubs or any kind of industrial facilities should be reused and repurposed, and public libraries in their new role, so in the role of the community hubs, are a perfect program that can reinvent this already built but not well used urban fabrics. And then maybe last point that I want to make is the accessibility. Public libraries should be also placed at the locations that are very well accessible by green mobility. So no way that nowadays we would do a public library in a monofunctional zone that is only accessible by private cars or very random public transportation. Public libraries should always be placed in the nodes that are very easily accessible, either by walking, cycling, or public transportation. I think that's very important, having in mind the new role of public libraries as the ones that teach us about sustainable living in the future. Let's now jump to a few examples. Next one, Priscilla. I have selected a few of them just to illustrate this conceptual framework that I was just describing. This is a Lokha library from Tilburg in the Netherlands, which is actually placed in an ex-train station. You can see these very large industrial elements within the building, which were very nicely repurposed for the needs of the library. This library is very respectful to the urban heritage, so all this industrial architecture is very present still nowadays. But as you can see, the function of the building is completely new. On one hand, it's library, but it's much more than the library. It's also the co-working space. It's also the place where people meet and exchange ideas and discuss the future ideas. It's the place where art interventions are at home. There are many public lectures in these large halls. So the library is a truly local community hub. That's one of the prime examples because it's managed to embed all these new programs in an old structure for the new purpose. Next one. I think we now go to the States. Yeah, this is one very interesting example from the Charlotte in North Carolina, which is a very successful merge of the two main programs. On one side, the library for the youngsters, and on the other side, it's the theater program. So you can see that two programs that are kind of compatible are placed within the same building. And this really brings new life to the area. What's very successful in this case is that this new activity that is taking place there is also making the public space in front of the library very lively. You can see this image. Many people are not just using the building, but really gathering in front of the building. It's a new community hub where the public life of the local community is taking place. And when we see this as urban planners, this makes us really happy because the building is not only introverted hub with different functions, but it actually spreads this public vibe into the area around it. And of course, it goes also vice versa. If the library is open to the public space, the public life would enter the library. And I believe that's also one of the goals of the library itself, to have many users, to have many people visiting it, and thus making use of the facility. Next one. That's another example from the States. It's about Berkeley Public Library in California. If you are interested into the sustainable buildings, that's a really good example because this is one of the libraries that's nearly carbon neutral. Partly due to the very well thought architecture, very well thought heating, cooling, lighting systems that were embedded into the system, but also thanks to the excellent accessibility options. This library was located so that it's very well accessible by green mobility, which again makes it kind of carbon neutral. At least that's what I read in the theory. I haven't visited this place by myself, but this library got many prizes for its environmental footprint, which is very low. Next one. This is an older example. I think it's from the 90s, but still serves as a good example. That's the previous one. Yes, there's a university library in Warsaw, which is a kind of postmodern in its architecture. So it uses these traditional materials like concrete, steel, and this kind of materials. But at the other hand, it's also promoting green architecture. This is one of the libraries that's probably the most green in Europe. Many green walls, many green courtyards, gardens are embedded into the architecture, which makes it a very pleasant studying environment. Why is this library important as a case study? Because it shows that even if the building itself is built in this traditional concrete technique and materials, you can add another layer which makes it much more environmentally friendly. And as I said at the beginning, that's a very important message that the users of the public libraries as important public institutions should get when they visit this kind of buildings. I think we have one more, or maybe two. Yeah, this is the example from Vienna. It's a university library, and this is an example that very clearly shows how the city library or university library can also become a landmark in the space and help brand the city as such. You can see that this architecture is very outstanding. It's, by the way, it's designed by Zaha Hadid, one of the leading contemporary architects who passed away, unfortunately. And by this challenging design, it's really saying that public buildings and public libraries are important buildings of our cities. Even when you enter this building, it's very distinctive in its design and architectural approach, which also is important from the educational point of view. The public library, if it's built anew, should also send a message to the public what the new architecture is about, what are the new options, and what the future of architecture may look like. Next one. I think that's the last example. It's a central library from Vancouver in Canada. It's a really large piece of the city, which is designed only for the purposes of the public library. However, this is, again, not only the library, it functions also as a creative center, as the center of arts, and it's also promoting the green future. As you can see, the roof, for example, in one part is completely green and trying to promote green gardening or urban gardening on this green roof. So these are a few examples that tried to illustrate how the principles of the contemporary library can be embedded into the architecture itself. If you allow me, and if I have a few more minutes, I would now very shortly present one project from my home city, Ljubljana. Next one, Priscilla. Oh, sorry, I forgot. We have another example in order to illustrate that the scale, maybe back Priscilla, yes, just not to forget, I was showing many examples that were showing large scale architecture, so library buildings at its biggest scale, but equally important for the local life are very small interventions that have library embedded into the core of the program. This is an example of a storypot in Newmarket in Canada, but you can find many examples like this around the globe nowadays. And this is very, very nice urban design intervention into the public space. It's in a way a kiosk that holds books and invites people to stop, to socialize, and to start conversations along reading the books. Again, I think here it's very clear that it's not only a library, but it's a place where people would stop, start conversations, start socializing, and that means that they would also build their social ties. Yes, and now we will jump to Ljubljana, where we would have a very distinctive national library, national and university library, which was designed in the first half of the previous century by very renowned architect Jože Plečnik. You can see it in this image. However, the library got too small until nowadays, and the new library is being conceptualized just next to the old one. And very shortly, I would present how the architectural profession nowadays is rethinking the library spaces. Next one. This is the position. The place with the arrows is actually the position of the new building, the new university library, which is just next to the old one, which is the red square to the right to the new one. Next one. Because this is a very historical part of the city, the library is actually intervening in the place where the oldest remains of the Roman city, which was in the place 2,000 years ago. And this intervention, of course, has to be very careful about building the site anew. It's not very clear from this image, if you're not an architect, what is new and what's existing, but all these gray shadows in the middle of the image are the remains of the old Roman walls. As you can see, the whole new concept of the library is following the existing heritage, and the new programs, the new lecture halls, the new reading rooms are organized in accordance with the heritage protection. Next one. If we move higher, then the concept, of course, of this public life brought into the public library is very clearly visible. You can see two perpendicular central halls that are actually not just serving the purpose of the library itself, but serve other programs as well, such as reading, lecture rooms, some co-working spaces, and so on. Next one. This is one image. Of course, the library is still not built, but this is how it should look like. This central area of the library should be actually a public hall where all the public life from the nearby streets and districts should meet and mingle in the best way possible. You can see that there are big stairways that would link the different levels of the library, but at the same time serve as a public space. So it's public space indoor, but really meant to bring public life into the library. Next one. And then this concept goes all the way to the top. As you can see, the library program is getting more intimate, more introverted. So there is more reading rooms, more kind of smaller halls that are really linked to the library program. However, this public hall in the middle is still penetrating all the way to the top. So that's very important to ensure that the library is not too introverted, but really kind of, yeah, covered with public life brought from the street. Next one, I think we have now section. That's just another explanation how these different programs are really trying to bring different activities into the building and actually link it to the public life on the streets. Next one. This is just a section just to show how this open space is actually penetrating the new building. Next one. And then also the public space design. As I said, the buildings should not be introverted nowadays. They must open to the streets, they must open to the squares, and they should also bring life to these public squares. That's why you can see that there are different entrances to the library, so that the connection between the public spaces, in this case the entry square, and the library itself is as straight as possible. Next one. Yeah, there's just another entrance from the other corner. Next one. Of course, when we build new libraries in this way, so that they are really community centers, they are quite large. The volumes get quite big. Next one, Priscilla. And next one. So if we compare the old building, which is circled now in red, and the new building, you can see that somehow they are alike in its volume. However, the new building, due to the many programs that it should support, is larger in the scale. And this can become a bit of an issue if you have a heritage protected city center, which is of medieval origin, and which would have very strict heritage protection regulation. Next one, Priscilla. If we zoom in now, next one. You can see that what the architects that were designing the new building were trying to achieve is a kind of a dialogue between the old building, which is also larger in scale than the traditional historical tissue, and the new one. This was done by purpose in order to echo the old library also at the symbolical level. Next one. And then if we look at the design of the library, you can see that there is also some attitude in terms of how they open this big volume with the windows. In the old library, architect Plečnik designed a big reading room with a large window which stretches over many floors in order to bring enough light into the reading room. And this is echoed in the new library. So there is a kind of a dialogue that the architects are trying to achieve by the design of the envelope of the building. Next one. And last but not least, also the architectural details, such as the facade and the textures of the facade. On the right-hand side, you can see how much attention Plečnik gave to the old National Library by using different materials, by using different geometries of placing these materials on the facade. And of course, nowadays we cannot repeat the same approach, but architects, as you can see, they were really trying to develop a kind of their own language that would remind us of the Plečnik's approach. And on the left-hand side, you can see the new library's facade, which is structured by the 2 rows of columns in order to have this effect of the rich texture of the envelope of the building. And by doing so, they also hope to make it smaller a bit in the perceptual image, so to make it look smaller. Next one. Last but not least, this is very technical description. It's the LEED standard for green buildings design, construction, and operation, as well as performance. So no matter how well thought the architecture language and architectural concept is in any new development of the public libraries, this is the standard that needs to be met. And this is a bit discussed now with the new library in Ljubljana. As you can see, there's a lot of glassy facades, lots of concrete used for the new construction. And of course, the new architecture will have to meet the requirements of the sustainable development. I'm putting this image on just to illustrate how important it is, besides the excellent architectural design, to also have these very technical requirements in the place in order to propose a sound new public library. Next one. And last but not least, as I said, the new public libraries must be the community space, and we cannot propose such places without getting public involved into the process. It's very good that excellent architectural designs are selected through the public calls. However, at some point, the public has to be involved in order to feel that that's their building at the end. This is very important, and sometimes we really forget about this. And not just that, not just public, but also interdisciplinary approaches are needed. Architecture is still too much embedded into its own things, into its own procedures and conceptual thinking, and is forgetting about other professions that should have a say in proposing new public buildings. In case of public libraries, of course, this is the profession of librarians themselves, but also other professions that should have a say in designing the new buildings. I'm saying this as an architect, a bit of a self-critique. I think we need to open our silos, our architectural silos, and really start cooperating with other professions and with general public in order to propose better public buildings at the end. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope I was not running too long.
Thank you, Matej, for sharing the interesting examples and your professional expertise with us. It's really valuable and inspiring. So next, we are going to have our Q&A section. So Anna and I are going to be the moderators today. So please feel free to type your questions in the chat or the Q&A box. I think we still have less than 5 minutes for the Q&A section. Maybe we can have 2 questions, I think, 1 or 2 questions. The first question is about the, because Matej, you mentioned about the urban regeneration and also the inclusive design across stakeholders. So do you think what is the roles of the political parties in terms of sustainable development in Slovenia or in your city? Is there any examples?
Yes, I think that's a very important question. I was mentioning how the profession, architecture and urban planning profession should approach urban planning of libraries, and then how important it is to include other professions into this discussion. Of course, some professions needs to be there by law, because you cannot escape aesthetics or other kind of technical checkings. But other professions, some other professions are really missing. I had in mind like urban sociology, urban psychology, and so on, that would really improve the perceptions and acceptance of these new buildings. Then the other one that I already mentioned is the public itself, so the end users that will use the building. However, all this is kind of manageable from the side of urban planning. We are very well used to moderate the processes, and if we list some stakeholders to be included, then it's us in charge to make sure that we come to the best result at the end. But what you asked, Priscilla, is a very important question, because there are some decision-making levels that do not allow us to decide ourselves, and that's usually the political level, the local administration and the local politics that actually decide to invest into the public facilities and public buildings. And quite too often, I would say, in practice, I see that there is no awareness of the need of the public buildings as such. You would have some strong and leading examples around the world, which I was also listing and showing. But there's lots of cities that would be either economically too weak or would not have this political level awareness that public buildings are really important. And in this case, it's really hard to proceed with providing good public buildings and really quality public places as such if there is no political support. So I think the profession should also kind of activate, not only my profession, urban planning profession, but all other professions that are actually active in the field of public facilities and public programs, and softly press on the political decision makers in order to provide better and better public buildings. So yeah, I hope I answered your question, Priscilla.
Yes, thank you, Matej. And we receive another questions from Jenny Bay. Yes, Anna, would you like to read about the questions?
Would like that I read it? Okay. If a library needs to choose between space for events programming and space for book collections, would you agree that space for community needs to be prioritized for librarians in the future?
Well, that's a very good question. Yes, my first answer would be yes, of course, I agree. However, I also like the books themselves. So this digitalization, complete this digitalization of the book stock, which happens in some cases nowadays, I think should not be the case. So the library should balance between these two. I believe that the library is the only space where you can access the books in their traditional format. So we should not completely get rid of it. However, I agree, if it's about many books, either many books and no public facility, other public facilities, or no books and just public facilities, probably I would go for no books, yes, because as I said, public library should serve as a community center. It's really important that it serves the needs of the community. That's the place where the community meets and does different activities, no matter what the activity is, from dancing to singing to reading to drawing. I really see the public library as this kind of institutions. Nowadays, the new typologies, of course, are developing the cultural centers, art centers, and any kind of, you just name it, any kind of public institutions that embed these public facilities. But I really like this link between the books and other activities that community is doing. So I would not say that you should prioritize these other activities over the books, but find the right balance between the library and our other activities. Otherwise, the library is not the library anymore. That's my point of view. But if you ask my colleagues, they might have another opinion again. Some are really book lovers and they would have as many books in stock at the place as possible. And then I would have colleagues who are totally into the digitalization and they say, why would you spend space with the books? They're online, you can get rid of the printed versions. But I really believe in the middle pathway.
Okay, thank you. We have more questions. Priscilla, you will read the next one, or?
I think we are running out of the time. So maybe one more questions.
Okay.
Yeah, I think a questions from Lavenia S. I think it's the last questions for today. The questions is, how does the library promote sustainable transportation options for visitors and staff, such as bike racks or electric vehicle charging stations?
This is very important question, and usually how we do it that we develop the so-called mobility plan. It can be developed for any kind of a public institution or private enterprise, but in essence, it tries to understand the needs of the users of the place. And these are on one hand, the users of the library space in the case of the libraries, and on the other hand, the employees. And when you understand where do they migrate from to the library and what are the destinations, then you usually check the already existing systems that would support greener mobility, like public transport, the presence of the biking infrastructure, and so on. And once you have this insight, then you decide what you as an institution would invest into in order to support people using this already existing infrastructure. Of course, in some cases, the existing infrastructure is not adequate. And then in this case, then you as an institution would normally contact the urban planning or any other city authority and start developing new infrastructure, linking the library to the wider space where your users come from. So on one side, you can do some small interventions, like I think somebody mentioned bike racks, electric vehicles yourself, but usually that's not enough. You have to be embedded into the wider urban infrastructure in order to really succeed in this endeavor.
Yes. Thank you, Matej. Thank you, Anna. Thank you all for your participation today. It's been our pleasure to host this event today and hope to see you again in the future in our next webinar. Okay, see you next time.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Thank
you.
you all. Goodbye.
Goodbye.